Hello and welcome to a very warm welcome to another edition of World Panorama, the only show that gets you your weekly roundup of all that's been happening in the international arena. I'm Ishan Russell and these are the headlines that we're tracking this week. The Group of Seven pledged to seek strong global growth while papering over differences on currencies and stimulus policies. World leaders also expressed concern over North Korea, Russia and maritime disputes involving China. The first World Humanitarian Summit held in Turkey. 65 heads of state and governments attend event. UN Secretary General calls for on commitments and lashes out at major players for snubbing summit. Barack Obama ends US arms embargo on Vietnam during maiden visit to former enemy. US President also performs with Vietnam's Queen of Rap and gives a lesson on free speech. And multiple blasts ripped through Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's heartland. Suicide attackers kill at least 148 in coastal Syria. Islamic State claims responsibility for the attacks. Now, top focus this week. The Group of Seven industrial powers pledged to seek strong global growth at the 42nd G7 summit held in Japan. The world leaders also expressed concern over North Korea, Russia and maritime disputes involving China.
The leaders of the Group of Seven rich economies pledged to collectively tackle major risks to global growth, including direct political threats to the international order from terrorist attacks, violent extremism and refugee flows. Meeting at a seaside resort in Shima, G7 leaders wrapped up their annual summit on Friday in central Japan, claiming a special responsibility for leading international efforts to cope with those challenges. They also committed to a cooperative approach in beefing up policies to stimulate and sustain growth of their sluggish economies. Weak demand and unaddressed structural problems are the key factors weighing on actual and potential growth. We have strengthened the resilience of our economies in order to avoid falling into another crisis and to this end commit to reinforce our efforts to address the current economic situation by taking all appropriate policy responses in a timely manner. We remain committed to ensuring that growth is inclusive and job-rich, benefiting all segments of our societies. The G7 host, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, appealed to his fellow leaders to act to avert another global crisis, comparing the current global economic situation to conditions just before the 2008 financial crisis.
The most worrisome risk is the contraction of the global economy. The greatest risk we face is that we do not take appropriate action. The global economy will go beyond the range of usual economic cycles and fall into a crisis. We at the G7 were able to share that strong sense of crisis.
G7 countries denounced protectionism and trade barriers. During talks on the sideline of the summit, the US, EU and Japan reiterated their determination to reach an agreement on various trade agreements meant to expand mutual market access.
The realization of the Japan, EU, EPA, FTA is something not only conducive to the economic growth of both Japan and the EU, but also the world economy.
In their declaration, the summit leaders cited a possible departure of Britain from the European Union depending on the outcome of the June 23rd vote as one of many potential shocks for the global economy.
If we were outside the EU, it would be far more difficult to achieve anything like this, anything on this scale, anything as comprehensive.
The leaders also expressed concern over territorial tensions in the East and South China Seas. The declaration does not mention China and its expansion into disputed areas specifically, but calls for respecting freedom of navigation and of overflight and for resolving conflicts peacefully through law. This prompted a stern reply from China telling G7 not to interfere with the South China Sea issue.
We believe that the G7 should focus their attention on managing their own internal issues rather than doing things they should not, such as criticizing other countries.
The summit declaration also highlighted joint efforts on corruption, cybercrimes, terrorism, global health and migration, which has become a huge headache especially for European nations as other top priorities. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha Television.
And joining me in the studio today is KP Nayar, consulting editor at the Telegraph. KP, to help us understand, the G7 summit is being touted as the big event of this week, but in actual achievements and actual moving forward or policy direction of the big 7 industrialized nations, how much have we achieved?
Well, it's a big event in the sense that the group of 7 has become more cohesive after Russian membership was suspended, because Russia was really an odd man out there. It didn't fit in, and Vladimir Putin, with his strong personality, was able to checkmate the G7 on many things, even on statements. I remember when the Syrian uprising started, it was Vladimir Putin who stopped the G7 statement from having a categorical demand for Assad's departure. So the group without Russia is certainly much more cohesive. They are able to take more decisions without disagreement, but at the same time it's a much diminished G7. You see, the kind of power, influence, money that G7 had at one time, it's no longer the case.
But that's primarily because of, I guess, economic growth and changing geopolitical considerations. But on the fact of the economy, all these countries realize that growth has really slowed down, and that is what they've flagged as well. And in terms of pressure, there is increasing pressure on each other amongst these countries, for example, on Britain, to not get, for example, too close to China. So how is the industrialized world approaching this problem of slow growth?
Well, the only solution is, in a way, to embrace G20, you know, which they are doing. You know, I mean, they don't want to jettison G7 because, after all, it's such an old group, and it's very nice for them still to get together like nothing has changed, you know. But even last year, Obama himself said that G20 has become the primary instrument of global action, and the focus, the more important event will be the G20 summit in September, and particularly because it's going to take place in China, because China is really, I mean, China, in spite of the slowdown, is still the big engine of growth. You know, in our country, we often talk about China's growth slowing down. Surely it has slowed down, but it has slowed down from 10% and 11% to 6.5 and 7%, you know. Then 6.5 and 7% is still big, considering that in G7, no country other than the United States has growth, projected growth this year of more than 2%, you know. But I also want to say that you know, these Gs are all, in a sense, something of the past. Nouriel Roubini, one of the few economists who predicted the 2008 crash, wrote the other day that we are living in a world of G0, you know. There is no single group that can anymore influence decision making like G7 did once upon a time.
All right, so then the question is, you mentioned China, and in terms of maritime security, that question was raised. Also about Russia and its annexation of Crimea was also raised, but China and the South China Sea have dominated the conversation, but really nobody can bell the cat as far as China is concerned. They can't do much, can they?
Well, as it happens at most summits, the summit agenda is influenced quite a bit by the host country. And for the next 1 year, Japan is going to be the chair of G7. And a lot of the elements that have dominated the dialogue and have come up in this statement have been influenced by Japan. For example, Japan Prime Minister Abe, in the run-up to the summit, he went to Sochi. He went to Sochi to meet Vladimir Putin, which is, if you look at it, in contradiction with the collective G7 stand. So Abe would like to not exactly bring back Russia into G7, but have a cordial relationship with Russia, which the Europeans agree to also, because, you know, winter is coming in a few months and their energy requirements have to be met largely by Russia. This is also reflected in the attitude to China because, you know, Japan's bigger problem is China, not so much Russia, despite the dispute on the Kuril Islands. So, what you referred to about Russia and China, in a way it is the reflection of the Japanese priorities.
All right, so the Japanese are really running the show, but as far as the EU and the European leaders are concerned, now there is a little bit of a worry about the European Union itself, and that was also reflected in the conversations over here about Brexit, about how that could negatively impact the European economies especially.
Yes, of course, and Europe is caught up in the migration crisis and terrorism. So, European problems are very, very severe. So, there are two strands within G7 at the moment. You know what is happening in Asia, the Asian priorities, and Japan. Although Japan's projected growth is only 0.5%, Japan recognizes that this is the Asian century. And India, China, even the Asian part of Russia, you know, the oil deposits, Vladivostok, all that constitute an engine of growth, really, you know. So, there is on the one hand the Asian segment which promises better future, more growth, and there is the European sector which is on a downward slope.
Right, so that needs
and
to be
amidst
stabilized.
all that, you know, America, the United States is caught up in an election year in
fact, President Obama mentioned about the fact that Trump would make world leaders uncomfortable. So, I mean, do you think, I mean, that was a comment directed back home, wasn't it?
Well, also, I mean, it's true because, you know, for example, I mean, Trump's positions keep changing every day, so one doesn't know where he stands today. But at one point, he said that the protection for Japan and Korea should be withdrawn. So, what does it mean if protection for Japan and South Korea is withdrawn, US protection? Then what happens? They have no option but to go nuclear, right? I mean, that's the only way they can potentially defend themselves. So, what Obama said is a serious problem, but I'm sure if Trump is elected president, he will change his position again on these.
We'll have to wait for that to happen. I mean, it's indeed a long time till the elections.
But the next G7 promises to be interesting if Trump is the president.
Whether Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton or even Bernie Sanders, he's still not out of the race that much. But thank you very much, KP Nayar, for coming in and helping us understand the impact of the G7 in terms of the news this week. Thanks so much for that.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Moving on now, on his maiden visit to Vietnam, US President Barack Obama said that the United States will lift a decade-long ban on selling lethal arms to Vietnam. He declared that the change will ensure that Vietnam has access to the equipment it needs to defend itself and removes a lingering vestige of the Cold War.
US President Barack Obama announced on Monday that Washington will fully lift an embargo on sales of lethal arms to Vietnam, underlining warming relations between the former foes amid rising tensions with Beijing over the South China Sea.
I can also announce that the United States is fully lifting the ban on the sale of military equipment to Vietnam that has been in place for some 50 years. As with all our defense partners, sales will need to still meet strict requirements, including those related to human rights. But this change will ensure that Vietnam has access to the equipment it needs to defend itself.
Vietnam's President Tran Dai Quang welcomed the move.
Vietnam very much appreciates the US decision to completely lift the ban on lethal weapon sales to Vietnam, which is a clear proof that both countries have completely normalized the relations.
Obama insisted that his decision to lift the embargo was not motivated by China's increasing strength in the South China Sea.
The decision to lift the ban was not based on China or any other considerations. It was based on our desire to complete what has been a lengthy process of moving towards normalization with Vietnam.
Before he left Vietnam, Obama held what has become a signature event of foreign presidential travel. It was a town hall style meeting with young people. Obama, the third US president to visit Vietnam since ties were restored in 1995, has made a strategic rebalance towards Asia Pacific a centerpiece of his foreign policy. Vietnam, where the United States was at war until 1975, has become a critical part of that strategy amid concerns about China's growing military might and its sovereignty claims in the South China Sea. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
Time for us to take a short break. On the other side, we'll get to the major highlights of the first World Humanitarian Summit held in Turkey. Stay tuned, we'll be right back. Welcome back, you're watching World Panorama. Now, the first World Humanitarian Summit opened on Monday in the Turkish city of Istanbul. Participants at the summit called for a better aid system and new focus on preventing troubles before it begins. As the summit drew to a close on Tuesday, some delegates pushed for a larger overhaul of the entire system.
"65 heads of state and governments, along with thousands of aid workers, politicians, civil society members, journalists and celebrities descended on Istanbul this week for the first ever World Humanitarian Summit. The UN sponsored the two-day summit, hoping the high-level meetings could help jumpstart or even fix the world's struggling aid system.
I urge you to commit to cutting half the number of internally displaced people by 2030. And to find better long-term solutions for refugees and displaced people based on more equal sharing of responsibilities.
However, leaders from some of the world's wealthiest countries were nowhere to be seen. Only one out of the group of 7 member states, who together made up nearly half of the global GDP last year, attended. United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon slammed their failure to attend.
It is a bit disappointing that some world leaders could not be here, especially those from the G7 countries, except Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany. They are some of the most generous donors of funding for humanitarian action. But I urge their greater engagement, particularly in the search for a political solution.
German Chancellor Angela Merkel was the only G7 leader to show up, while the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, France, Italy and Japan sent lower-ranking officials to represent their delegations. The summit focused on 5 core responsibilities: preventing and ending conflict, respecting rules of war, leaving no one behind due to forced displacement, working differently to end need through innovation, and investing in humanity politically and financially.
Erstens, wir brauchen einen erneuerten globalen Konsens.
What do we need? Firstly, we need a renewed global consensus on humanitarian principles. Actually, it's a catastrophe that we have to talk about international law being met. And still we experience in Syria, in Yemen and in other countries that systematically hospitals are being attacked, health centers are being destroyed and doctors losing their lives. This is flagrantly against humanitarian principles.
Ärzte ihr Leben verlieren.
Not all the voices resonated with positive tones. One of the world's top humanitarian organizations, Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, boycotted the summit. It questioned if the meeting would hold states accountable for starting and perpetuating the crisis. The summit neglects to reinforce the obligations of states to uphold and implement the humanitarian and refugee laws which they have signed up to. And then there's the fact that Turkey, with its controversial human rights record and what critics say is increasing authoritarianism, was the summit host. The country, which is now home to over 2.7 million Syrian refugees, recently came under fire for allegedly shooting refugees when they tried to cross the border to safety. Turkey, which is currently being targeted by Islamic State as well as by Kurdish militants, has slammed the international community for not sharing the burden of the refugee crisis.
Şu anda
We needed to take a step for readmission agreement as of 1st of June, and they needed to take a step for visa liberalization as of June 30th. Our Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister of European Union will hold these talks. If an agreement is not reached in these talks, no offense, but the delegation on taking necessary steps on implementing the readmission agreement will not be approved in this parliament.
But despite the criticism and what some call lofty aspirations for change, the UN called for all hands on deck, saying that such change could indeed take place if only states like those whose leaders did not attend the summit stepped up to the plate. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha Television.
Now, more than 148 people were killed on Monday in suicide bombings claimed by the Islamic State group in northwestern Syria. These were the deadliest attacks to date in the regime's coastal heartland. Islamic State claimed responsibility for the attacks in the cities that have up to now escaped the worst of the violence. It is said that it was targeting members of President Bashar al-Assad's minority community. Here are the details.
Seven near-simultaneous explosions targeted bus stations, hospitals and other civilian sites in the seaside cities of Jable and Tartus, which until now had been relatively insulated from Syria's 5-year war.
I got here and I parked, the explosion happened. I was standing here. There was a car behind me that got burned. I saw martyrs on the ground. I couldn't get my car out or anything. Thank God after all. But this is not destiny. These are terrorist acts.
The attacks on strongholds of President Bashar al-Assad's regime came as Islamic State faces mounting pressure in Syria and neighboring Iraq, where a major offensive to retake the jihadist-held city of Fallujah is underway. Syrian Observatory for Human Rights monitor said 100 people were killed in Jable and another 48 in Tartus to the south. Islamic State claimed the blast in a statement, saying they were in retaliation for Syrian regime and Russian airstrikes against the jihadists and vowed to carry out more devastating and bitter attacks. Islamic State is not known to have a presence in Syria's coastal provinces, where its jihadist rival, the Al-Qaeda-affiliated Al-Nusra Front, is much more prominent. But Islamic State, notorious for using deadly sleeper cells to attack its enemies, suggested the creation of a Wilayat al-Sahel, or Islamic province, for the coastal area. The early morning attacks began at a bus station in Tartus, where regime ally Russia has long maintained a naval facility. The observatory said a car bomb exploded, and as people began to flock to the site, 2 suicide bombers detonated explosive bells. Around 15 minutes after the Tartus blast, 4 explosions rocked Jable further north. The observatory said a car bomb and 3 suicide attackers targeted the bus station, a hospital and a power station.
We went to help the injured. Once we got closer to the car, an explosion took place inside the hospital. When the explosion took place, we returned back for 5 minutes. A girl exploded herself in the emergency department in the hospital. When we knew that, we went back to help the injured and martyrs, and we started to move them in ambulance to private hospitals.
The attacks drew condemnation from around the world, while Human Rights Watch warned that targeting civilians would appear to constitute war crimes. UN Chief Ban Ki-moon denounced the terrorist attacks, while France called the bombing heinous.
The Secretary General condemns the terrorist attacks today that claimed the lives of dozens of civilians in the Syrian coastal towns of Jable and Tartus. The Secretary General also takes note with great concern of the escalating military activity in many parts in and around Damascus. The violence, particularly in Daraya, Aleppo and Idlib, and in the northern countryside of Homs, especially Al-Hula, is causing mounting civilian casualties.
U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry spoke to Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov by phone and urged him to press the Syrian regime to halt its attacks on Aleppo in the north and Daraya near Damascus. The Kremlin said the attacks demonstrate yet again how fragile the situation is in Syria and the need to take energetic measures to relaunch peace talks. World powers have struggled to rekindle UN-brokered peace negotiations, which fizzled in April when Syria's opposition walked away in frustration at stalling progress on the country's dire humanitarian situation. Syria's conflict has evolved from a popular uprising to a multifaceted war that has killed more than 270,000 people and displaced millions more. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
Let's shift now focus and bring you up to speed with all the sports news that you might have missed this week. Here's all the sports action.
Lyon claimed their third Women's Champions League title on Thursday with a dramatic penalty shootout victory over Wolfsburg after the final finished 1-1 in Reggio Emilia. Norwegian Ada Hegerberg gave the French side a 12-minute lead, but Lyon failed to put the game to bed and Germany international striker Alexandra Popp pounced to equalize with just 2 minutes left of the regular 90. Extra time too could not separate the two teams and the game went into penalties. Spanish tennis maestro Rafael Nadal registered his 200th Grand Slam victory by thrashing Argentina's Facundo Bagnis in straight sets in the second round of the French Open on Wednesday. With the win, Nadal became only the 8th man to reach the milestone. Roger Federer, who had earlier withdrawn from the tournament due to a back injury, tops the all-time list of Grand Slam matches won on 302. Russian tennis player Maria Sharapova has been named in her country's squad for the forthcoming Rio Olympics. The five-time Grand Slam champion was handed a provisional suspension from the sport in March after she revealed that she had tested positive for the banned substance meldonium at the five-time Grand Slam champion was handed a provisional suspension from the sport in March after she revealed that she had tested positive for the banned substance meldonium at this year's Australian Open. Meldonium was banned by WADA this year, but the tennis star said that she had been taking the drug since 2006 legally for health reasons.
Now, Sydney, Australia is awash with colour as the annual Vivid Sydney Festival kicked off on Friday and runs for 23 nights until the 18th of June. Vivid Sydney is the world's largest festival of light, music and ideas. We're going to leave you today with some amazing visuals from the festival. Thanks so much for watching.